So I'm gonna be very brief, y'all, because we got a whole lot of stuff to talk about. We're here with like four very, very smart people who know a lot more about this subject than me. So I'm going to make sure that they have their time to talk about that. Thank you, Hester, for the very warm welcome. When you got like giants and patriarchs around you, you gotta let them do their thing. So I appreciate it. Even as modest as I am, it's embarrassing sometimes. I'm still getting used to that. Thank you, sir. First, we're going to start with Mr. Carr, and then we're going to go with Mr. Chris Fox, Mr. Rossman, and then Ms. Manley at the end. Remember, 10 minutes, guys. Okay, I don't want to be the referee in here to pull anybody out, but I will. We have our timekeeper right here to your front. So first, without any further ado, Mr. Carr.
Good afternoon. Let me just first say I'm honored to be asked to share my thoughts with you today about the current financial distress of Detroit, as well as many other large industrial cities. Let me just start off by saying I started this day on a real high. Did any of you see USA Today? Did any of you? Let me see a show of hands. How many people saw? Well, so you may understand why I started the day on a high, but I guess I was a little bit sleepy because I picked up USA Today, I stuck it in my bag, and I just gleaned the headlines. And I said, boy, John Powell and crew have done it. They've gotten this conference to the front of USA Today. The headline is, "There is Hope, Reversing Paralysis." And right next to it, it says, "Obama to act." I walked over here saying, they're on fire. That's because I was optimistic, right? That it says, reversing paralysis, this device restores some functions for 4 million people with spinal injuries, and Obama to act on equal pay laws. Well, so that's the headlines. But at least you know that my head is in the right place, because I came here really enthusiastic about a rich and powerful conversation, and I'm very pleased to say that so far it has been the conversation that I hoped it would be. And one of the things that's kind of interesting is many of the things that I will say, I will repeat some of the things that were said before, but I'm hopeful that I put them together maybe in a way that's slightly different than some others have. Not that it makes it better, but that it gives you yet another way to think through a lot of the information that's being put down, because repeating ourselves is actually not a bad thing. And I think most important, it was stated this morning, Wallace did a good job of driving this point home, is that we really are talking about two conversations here. The first conversation is on the bankruptcy of Detroit, and that is what has captured most of the news and the headlines and the conversations. But the truth is, the bankruptcy of Detroit is really a little issue. It's a technical issue. In fact, it's an issue that doesn't even have to be an issue, right? It's a technical issue. The bigger, more substantial issue is the current economic distress of Detroit and other large cities, which unfortunately really doesn't get much attention because bankruptcy gets the attention. And the bankruptcy carries so much negativity with it and so much misrepresentation of the facts that the reality of the economic distress of Detroit and other cities just gets lost. So one of the things that this conference can do, because the name of the conference is Beyond Bankruptcy, is really focus beyond the bankruptcy, because the bankruptcy isn't the issue. It's the economic distress. And this economic distress didn't just happen last week or last month or 1 year ago. We all know that Detroit reached its peak population back in the 1950s, so these are problems that have been percolating now for more than half a century, and they've simply gotten worse. And we know, for example, that Detroit's municipal bonds were downgraded for the first time, to my knowledge, by Moody's as far back as 1992. And so we know that there was some mismanagement of local government, there's been corruption, but the challenges and the plight of Detroit and other large urban cities, particularly older manufacturing cities, cannot be reduced to simplicity of bad management and corruption. In fact, there are three forces that have come together that have put our cities in the condition that they're in, and I'm going to go through all three of them. And what's important is that the three are really overlapping and intertwined, but it's important to talk about them separately because they didn't have to all be there, and they certainly didn't have to be intertwined. Also, when we start looking at solutions, the solutions must be on the magnitude of the problems that created it. And in fact, most people will tell you that problems always require more effort to resolve than they took to make, right? So you can get drunk, get behind the wheel of a car and crash into a wall, but you're going to do more than not drink to recover from that, right? You could die. And so these processes have been in place now since the middle of the last century, and it's important to recognize that. And then I'll come back to why I think it's important in my conclusion. Now, I think I've probably already used 5 of my 10 minutes. So first of all, there were several policies, and what's important about these policies is many of these policies were specifically and intentionally created to build the strong middle class that we have today. And so those policies included the 1956 Federal Interstate Highway Act that was mentioned earlier today. It created millions of jobs, except that those jobs were outside of the cities. And it provided the infrastructure to allow jobs to leave the city as, in fact, cheap land became available in the suburbs. So rather than renovating your building or buying new property within the city limits now, with the Federal Highway Act, you could now leave the city. That was reinforced with the Federal Housing Administration. Now, many people think of that as housing because it created what ultimately became the low down payment 30-year fixed rate mortgage. But the truth is FHA was as much of a jobs program during the Great Depression as it was a housing program. And so FHA focused on suburbs as the place where it provided its greatest subsidies. And so there you had a second round of jobs. Well, so we often think about FHA as creating the low down payment mortgage and the asset called homeownership, but it created, once again, millions of jobs, all outside of the cities, because the public policy of FHA was not to support housing and homeownership within inner cities. So you had two programs now that were happening outside of the cities. When it came to inside the cities, we had urban renewal. Urban renewal was not about job creation. Urban renewal was about slum relocation. And what it did was it destroyed some of the most vibrant, it did mow down many distressed neighborhoods, but it also just simply moved people from one part of the city to the other to get them away from areas of the city that often were considered the viable downtowns, the arts and culture centers, major universities. Just get those people away and replace them with neighborhoods that were high-rise, high-density structures that became instant sources of concentrated poverty. And as anyone who knows anything about poverty, poverty is a challenge over here, but concentrated poverty is a whole new world. And so that federal policy created concentrated poverty. Next were cutbacks in state intergovernmental assistance, and we see that right here in the state of Michigan. Rather than offering Detroit countercyclical economic support during a time of major economic crisis, and in fact, the shortfall that was referred to earlier today as being $198 million, that entire amount was a result of, or an amount equal to that, was a result of the Great Recession. The loss of jobs, particularly in 2008, the revenues associated with that, and cutbacks in state intergovernmental payments. And so Detroit did not have the state to rely on. And then in the case of Detroit, yes, there was some irresponsible financial management, and we've talked about that, which were the financial instruments that should never have been used and may hopefully be voided. Now, at the same time, there was discrimination. The reason I say these things are separate and apart, even though they're interrelated, is FHA did not have to discriminate against African Americans. It simply chose to. And so by barring African Americans by using FHA in the suburbs, it guaranteed that African Americans, remain heavily concentrated in the inner cities, where in fact the job opportunities were not, and also the home ownership opportunities were not, compounded by urban renewal. And then we also had the lack of access to those jobs in the suburbs. So we often just think, well, with the loss of FHA not being able to move to the suburbs, you lost the opportunity for home ownership. but we also lost the opportunity to be part of those millions of jobs that were created to build the suburbs all across America. And then the third thing, we had, of course, the urban riots. And many cities haven't recovered from the urban riots, but the riots were quite understandable as they were a part of the civil rights movement and a lot of outrage and a lot of social unrest. And then finally, again, growing concentrated poverty resulting. All of these things are discrimination. Well, I guess the last piece of the discrimination card was the predatory lending, the last round of these subprime loans, which I think really put the nail in the coffin of many cities, including Detroit. And then the third thing were market forces. We had, of course, companies now taking advantage of the interstate highways to move out of the cities. We also had companies ultimately not only left the cities for the suburbs, but they eventually left the suburbs and went offshore. So that is sort of how we got to where we are today. And that is a story whereby, although we kind of know it, that is not the narrative on older industrial cities. And I'll come back to that very quickly on why I think that's important in terms of what we specifically need to do. The second issue is the immediate crisis. The immediate crisis, as we've already talked about, so I won't talk about that in any real length, is the issue of bankruptcy. And we know that the issue of bankruptcy really is the issue of $198 million. It is not an issue of $18 billion because Detroit is not a corporation, it is a city. And Chapter 9 does not require that it resolve all of its long-term debt. And in fact, as many of the speakers have talked about today, several of the things that have already been done under the name of the emergency manager have actually worsened the economic plight of Detroit rather than improved it. And so that issue needs to be dealt with separately, but all of these issues in a way also need to be dealt with directly. And so here are my thoughts. First of all, just to sort of wrap up very quickly, we first have to change the narrative because the narrative is decidedly not working in our favor. And that narrative includes getting information out that puts the distress of urban communities ahead of this very high-profile thing called municipal bankruptcy, in the case of Detroit, $18 billion. And the fact is, even though Demos has done this extraordinary report that Wallace talked about, most Americans can't be aware of it because every single day, every time you read an article, it starts off with Detroit and $18 billion. We must change that, and we must put it into context. The second thing, as Angela pointed out at lunch, we need to change the conversation. We need to build that conversation because it's really not us versus them. It may have been a half a century ago, us versus them, but now it's 99% of us and them. So I think 99% is pretty fair odds to call it us working together. We need to change that because America's economy isn't working for the middle class any more so than it's working for moderate income households. Third, we have to think boldly. We didn't get into this mess with just local strategies and community organizing working together to launch an initiative. We have to have involvement, significant involvement at the federal level, and we must have significant level and engagement at the state level, but that actually starts with really profoundly bold initiatives at the local level. We have to change the paradigm in some important ways. Detroit must find a way to change the conversation about how it leverages its municipal assets in a way that no city has ever done before and really gets people to talk. And I can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A. And then the last thing, we need to point out how everyone stands to benefit together. African Americans and Latinos and people of color generally are the fastest growing shares of the U.S. population, and within a little over 3 decades will be the majority of the U.S. population. The issues on the table are not just the future of Detroit, it's also the future of America's economic competitiveness in the world. Its national security issues are at stake. What kind of future will America have if its fastest growing and majority population can't access jobs any more so than waiting tables or being greeters at Fortune 500 with less than minimum wage or minimum wage and no benefits? That is not a conversation that leads to a very strong competitive America. This is all sort of the pieces that need to come together as we change the narrative about why helping Detroit to work its way out of the distress it's in is really helping America into the 21st century. We've started off this century in the worst of ways. Detroit can help us turn the corner and go through this century in a very powerful way, but we will have to be very creative, we will have to be very innovative, and we will have to be very provocative if we're going to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank the conference organizers for asked me to participate. And they asked me to participate because I had worked in Detroit over a variety of times over the last few years, and they also wanted to give you guys some insight into what's happening in Puerto Rico. And I'll be in Puerto Rico again tomorrow morning. I have been working since the downgrade on the rating agencies have downgraded Puerto Rico's debt in February, and see some of the parallels on how both of the jurisdictions have the challenges that they're facing and some of the solutions that they're pushing at this moment. So since 2000 to 2010, Detroit lost about 25% of its population. Oh, and I should say that, let me go back and finish my intro better. That for the conference is called Beyond Bankruptcy, but for the role I play with the union, I'm not beyond bankruptcy. I mean, we're very much in bankruptcy and looking at how the mediation process is still going on through the formal bankruptcy process, and so we are not beyond it. We are very much in it and trying to work our way through it with not a tremendous amount of leverage or ability to push back. So having said that, but so when I first came to Detroit, it was about 2009, and I was asked to participate in a fact-finding, which is what happens when labor unions and employers cannot come to a joint resolution, and there's an impasse proceeding, and our local unions who represent municipal workers here in the city of Detroit were in fact-finding. And I was brought in to give testimony about the city's fiscal policies. One of the things that had happened in 2009 or thereabouts was a downgrade by the bond rating agencies of Detroit's debt. And when that happened, Detroit needed to, based on the covenants of their bonds, they needed to come up with some extra money. So that put an increased pressure on a city that had about 25% unemployment in 2009, 2010, whose income tax receipts had dropped by 30% since 2002. Obviously, income tax is going to follow population loss. To put that in perspective, around in the fiscal year of 2000, Detroit had $378 million of income tax collection. That went to the general fund. By 2004, that had dropped to $291 million. Now, for most jurisdictions, state and local, that have an income tax or a sales tax, 2004 coming out of the 2001-2000 recession would have been the low point. And then they had some time before the recession, the big recession hit. Detroit never left recession. Neither did the state of Michigan, frankly. And so from 2004, income taxes continued to drop. And they hit a low of about $217 million in fiscal year 2010. They're projected to grow to about $250 million over the next few years. But still, that's way below $378 million, which was the 2000 year. At the same time, state revenues, this is a big part of this picture, which I've heard talked about earlier today, have decreased significantly. So from 98 to 2002, on a fiscal year basis, Detroit averaged about $330 million from the state of Michigan in revenue, from various revenue sharing programs. Now, some is a loss of population, but Detroit, and even as late as fiscal year 2010, with Michigan having never exited the recession, was about $263 million of state revenue sharing. Detroit is now projecting somewhere in the area of $170 million of state revenue sharing. So it's a dramatic drop. Some of it is based on formulas tied to population. So if your population drops by a quarter, you're going to have less of that revenue sharing. But the other big thing that happened, because when you say that there was some slough off of that revenue aid, but through 2010, it seemed that the politicians in Lansing have decided there's a floor that Detroit can function at if we can possibly provide those resources. And we know what the election of 2010, what happened, not just in Michigan, but around the country. A very significant turn. There's been a change in the Republican Party in how they go about their business, and you see the decline in revenues for state, local, school budgets in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and you can go on, is significant, where that party has total control of the executive and the legislature. And so that's a part of it. Plus, there were other laws that put into effect how much you could have, how much the jurisdiction could pay for employee health care. It had to go to 80-20. So then I was brought in after the fact finding in 2010, going into 2011, to help with some bargaining. The city was asking for more concessions. There was an emergency manager enacted. The local unions had very little leverage and were very concerned about what would happen if an emergency manager was declared. We quickly agreed to do 80-20 share on health care, 20% on the employee side from 90-10, which had been a concession not very long before. The 26 furlough days, which had come through a fact finding, which was a 10% reduction in wages, were changed into a 10% reduction of salary overall. In Puerto Rico, there is a population decline happening, about 1% year over year. They have budget deficits that far outstrip anything that Detroit on a percentage basis. I mean, they have about a $9.5 billion general fund, and they run more than $2.5 billion of deficit, although they've gotten it down to about $800 million. They did a downgrade. When Standard & Poor's and Moody downgraded them, their basically capital call at that point was $900 million that they were going to have to come up with to satisfy the covenants under their bond agreements. And they had about 90 days to do it. So they went out and they borrowed more money. And I would suggest to you that's not going to be a great answer for Puerto Rico. So the government is now at its constitutional limit on how much it can borrow. $13 billion is what they have for general fund obligation. And I can finish in 1 minute. So they need to balance their budget by July 1, which is why I've been going down there periodically. And that is a Herculean task for a number of reasons, what I won't get into. But in specifics, if you've run a deficit every year since at least 2006, it's very hard to figure out how to work to balance. So all those same strategies are in effect that Detroit has used. And we're also dealing with a history where in Puerto Rico several years ago, they passed a measure called Law 7 that suspended all collective bargaining rights for a period of time, and then they were able to implement pretty carte blanche whatever they needed to do to fix the problem. We're about 4 years later. Obviously, there's still another problem, and we know most likely something akin to Law 7 will be passed again. It's a lot like an emergency manager law. So I don't have much thoughts on how to get beyond bankruptcy because I tend to work within the box that I've just described. But I just offer some specifics on some of those challenges for you all to think about. Thanks.
So my name is Stuart Rossman, and I'm the litigator. The famous litigator you've heard about, right. Litigation is probably the worst possible way to affect change and to establish public policy, but it sure is a hell of a good way to start that change from taking place. It gains a lot of attention, and it begins to get people to focus on the problems that exist. So I'm the pain in the neck that starts all this problem, and we've been dealing with this across the country, dealing with the systemic problem that we're going to be discussing today, which is holding Wall Street accountable for the subprime mortgage crisis that has affected our entire country. So I'm going to start with a story, and it's a story of how our system was broken and what caused the crisis to be unprecedented in terms of the work that is that we're doing right now. Before I do that, I just want to stop for a second and just say two things. First of all, I am here, as you can see from the slide. I am the Director of Litigation at the National Consumer Law Center. NCLC is based out of Boston. We are a 43-year-old organization that represents low-income and elderly consumers on a national basis. We were originally part of the Legal Services Corporation. We are now a 501c3 private organization representing those interests. The second thing I wanted to point out, since it wasn't raised beforehand, but since everyone gets a shout out for their alma mater, I'm a proud graduate of the University of Michigan, and I'm pleased to be back in my home state. So it's great to be here. I wish we could be celebrating the NCAA championship, but that's a whole nother story. So this story starts in the late 1990s, when changes in the laws in the United States allowed banks for the first time, investment banks, to bundle securities and sell them on Wall Street. And what they very quickly found out that some of the most lucrative things that you could bundle together and sell were debts. And the most lucrative debts that you could sell were, in fact, subprime loans. Subprime loans created two great situations for you. You could go there, the subprime loans had higher interest rates. If they had higher interest rates, they had a higher rate of return. If you had a higher rate of return, you could sell them for higher prices when you went to Wall Street. And you had this wonderful pattern that you could tell the investors that, first of all, it was a safe investment because it was secured by real estate. And after all, real estate prices always go up. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, right, okay. I should point out that as we were screaming about this in the early 2000s, when the real estate market really was rising at astronomical levels, even in 2003, 2004, real estate prices in places like Detroit, in Cleveland, and other urban areas were going down at that very time. It was a fallacy even when they were doing it. But in any event, they were able to offer great rates of returns on a secured loan. They were able to bundle together and sell them. And it was literally a license to print money. And as a result, they started working with subprime lenders, they started dealing with brokers, and they started to flood the market with these toxic loan products that had horrible provisions in them, and they had terrible predatory features to them. The difference between this crisis, predatory lending crisis, and every crisis beforehand is that subprime lenders, for the most part, were small banks. They had limited resources. The problem in 2000 and afterwards was that Wall Street was fueling this. This is turbo predatory lending. This is predatory lending on speed. It was an inexhaustible supply of funding, and they were going to prop up these subprime lenders and try to force these toxic loans into the communities. Who would get these loans? Well, it was inevitable. After 50 years of redlining, preventing communities of color, particularly in urban centers, from having access to mortgage money, we have a new phenomenon, which we now call reverse redlining, where the very communities that were avoided for 50 years were being targeted. It was like taking a small flame that had been basically suffocated by not getting oxygen and hitting it with a jet flow, an absolute jet flow. And the market was absolutely going crazy. And not of great surprise on it, most of these loans were going to the African American community in those communities as well. These loans, no one cared. People tell me, well, there was poor underwriting. Ladies and gentlemen, there was not poor underwriting. There was no underwriting. And the reason for that was very simple. The subprime lenders and the brokers got paid at closing. The investment banks sold it on Wall Street within 3 to 6 months, and they got paid. And when the you-know-what hit the fan, 6 months to a year later, no one was there except for the poor homeowner who was left trying to deal with a loan that was probably unaffordable from the moment that it had been placed. But they had been paid, they had moved on. It is truly a situation where they were able to act with impunity. No great surprise, this led to an unprecedented foreclosure rate. These loans were were probably unsustainable, as I said from the very beginning, but very quickly they would get rolled over. You'd see these predatory loans 2 or 3 times over because you could earn the profit 2 or 3 times over, and it resulted in terrible foreclosure rates. Now, we have seen cases brought by government agencies and by investors against the banks claiming that these were actually bad investments. And some of them actually have settled, most of them not really for what is even close to the amount of profit that the investment banks made on these transactions. But what no one has bothered to do is to worry about the mortgagors, the homeowners who had promised the American dream about being able to buy their own homes. No one has tried to vindicate their interests until the lawsuit that we filed in October of 2012. And I have to give a shout out to our co-counsel. It's the Michigan ACLU, the National ACLU, and the law firm of Leif Cabraser Hyman in San Francisco, who's working with us. We filed suit in the Southern District of New York against Morgan Stanley. And the basic theory of the case is very simple. As we were talking about here, let's see, this is the basic setup of it. So we have Morgan Stanley was the securitizer. They would provide the money to New Century Bank, which was one of the largest subprime lenders in Michigan. New Century would then turn around with its brokers and it would place the loans in primarily minority communities, which would then be securitized on Wall Street. New Century was one of the most aggressive and dangerous predatory lenders in the country. Here are some of the national figures. You can see in 2008, New Century topped the OCC's worst 10 in the worst 10 list. That's quite an accomplishment, particularly since New Century had filed for bankruptcy in May of 2007. They got away with their problems. They were able to protect themselves. And Morgan Stanley was the primary financer for New Century loans. Over half of New Century loans were financed through Morgan Stanley. Basically, Morgan Stanley said jump, and New Century said how high. The problem we're dealing with here are what we call combined risk loans. This is not a legal phrase. We sort of made it up, but it's based on case law that is out there. These loans were adjustable rate mortgages. They had prepayment penalties. They had balloon payments at the back end. There was debt to income ratios which were untenable. There were stated income. No one was checking the income of the individuals, and the loan to value ratios were unprecedented in terms of them being acceptable. And Morgan Stanley required that New Century place these toxic loans in the community. They were basically calling the shots in terms of what kind of loans they wanted to put together for their securities. Between 2004 and 2007, Morgan Stanley had 62 securitizations that included New Century loans that had Detroit properties included in them. 62 securitizations. We know, and this comes from the complaint, which you can find on our website, that the parties knew right from the very beginning that these loans were untenable. They knew that they were being based on underwriting standards that would not have been accepted by any kind of auditor under any excuses. As you see here, we have a quote from a Morgan Stanley trading desk official saying, "We are telling you to lie to us." No one cared about what was going to happen tomorrow, just pay us today. 31% of the New Century loans were securitized by Morgan Stanley, had loan-to-value ratios that were more than 100%. They were loaning more than the property was worth, and you can imagine what that did in Detroit. They were also inflating the appraisal values. I just finished taking the depositions, or defending the depositions of our class representatives here, and in every single one of the cases, their homes were being overappraised in order to be able to justify the loan, and the consumer was being told, look, if you want to buy your home, this is the way it's got to be done. Did they make a mistake by agreeing to it? Yes. Am I going to hold them blameworthy? No. Prior to this crisis, 1% of all loans, conventional loans, were foreclosed. FHA loans, which were riskier, had a 2% loan rate. During the foreclosure crisis, the rates averaged between 4.5% to 8%, which was unprecedented for those times. For Morgan Stanley with New Century, 20% of their loans were foreclosing, and in Detroit, that was 35.7. 1 in every 3 New Century Morgan Stanley loans was foreclosed in Detroit. And that was understated because the figures only go up through 2008 when Morgan Stanley went broke. Hopefully we'll have some new data. It didn't get better, I can assure you. Detroit had a loan-to-value ratio was 98% of the value. That was because of the over-appraisals. 80% were adjustable rate loans, which re-triggered after a year or two, which led to the foreclosures. And 40% of the loans were stated income loans. Here's where the case comes in. Under the Fair Housing Act, we're claiming that Morgan Stanley's policies, when applied in the marketplace, resulted in a disparate impact affecting African-American consumers in the greater Detroit area, the 9-county Detroit area. The rate of foreclosure among African-Americans was 28% higher than the rate of foreclosure among white borrowers. And whereas white borrowers got 3.7 times the number of non-high-cost loans, black borrowers received nearly 10 times more high-cost loans than non-high-cost loans. And here's the bottom line figure, ladies and gentlemen. Controlling for income, controlling for credit, if you're an African-American consumer in the greater Detroit area, you had a 70% greater chance of getting a toxic loan from New Century and Morgan Stanley than a comparably placed white consumer. In statistical terms, that is known as robust data. That is robust data. We brought this suit under the Fair Housing Act. The court denied our request for injunctive relief because New Century's out of business. I don't think that's quite right because Morgan Stanley most certainly is in business, even though it's not doing subprime lending. But we're going forward on the case seeking a disgorgement of unjust enrichment. Morgan Stanley made profit off the backs of Detroit homeowners, and they should not be allowed to keep that profit if they earned it through predatory practices, through discriminatory practices. The good news is that the court denied the motion to dismiss. We have just completed discovery. I'm going to change one thing. I can't talk about the discovery quite yet because we're under a confidentiality order, but expert reports and class certification briefs are due in May, and we are going to try very hard to have this publicly disclosed because as much as we want to win this case, bring it to the attention of the public is almost as important on behalf of our consumers. This establishes an important principle. Wall Street cannot ignore the impact of its financial investment decisions. They are changing people's lives, they're destroying communities, they're destroying neighborhoods, and they have to be held accountable.
Hey, everybody. My name is Renee Manley, and I work for the Service Employees International Union, and I'm so happy to be here today. And it's amazing, to hear about the housing situation and its impact on Detroit, which we see every day when we're riding down the streets of Detroit, and to hear from my colleague, Chris, who's, involved in the collective bargaining process and the impact that has on the folks that, we see every day when we go, to take advantage of the city services that we expect cities to provide, governments to provide. I want to bring a different frame to the work. I'm an organizer, that's what I do, and I organize, I know it sounds strange, I organize pension fund trustees, and I organize people around the money. And it's a lot of money. We're talking about billions of dollars. So I'm going to go back and talk a little bit about why Detroit matters and why SCIU, who doesn't have a strong public sector presence here in Detroit, but why we are here and what we have been doing. And then I want to talk a little bit about how income inequality, Angela mentioned that today, and I want to drill down on some numbers around Detroit and income inequality to really highlight, how extensive and expansive the impact of income inequality has had on Detroit. When Detroit filed the largest municipal bankruptcy in recent history. It's been a city in distress for decades, right? We all agree on that, right? It's been victimized, and I use that word, I chose that word for a reason, by mass deindustrialization and then accompanying loss of residents and economic activity to the suburbs over the last 20 years. However, the bankruptcy is an event orchestrated by parties with a sinister purpose. They have an agenda to destroy public sector unions in the city, to cripple the city's service delivery infrastructure, and to dilute the votes of the urban core city. That's my opinion, okay? They believe that this maneuver was orchestrated by forces led by some of the folks that people have mentioned, Koch brothers, Alec, we can name names, right? You can probably name even more specific names, right? But it's important to understand that this is not just about Detroit and what happens within the confines of Detroit, right? This will serve as a roadmap for other cities. And people are watching how this debate and dialogue around the Detroit bankruptcy evolves, right? I know that every pension fund conference that I've been to since last fall has had a panel or a discussion or a dialogue around the Detroit bankruptcy. People are concerned about how this will impact folks not just in Detroit but nationally. So there will be attempts to replicate what works from the Detroit bankruptcy. Right? Some folks are watching because they want to take elements because they also have an agenda and they want to destroy pensions in other places, right? They want to attack public employee unions in other places. They want to see service delivery and disenfranchisement of urban core voters in other places. So this whole narrative around Detroit's public sector pensions and its impact on the bankruptcy is the narrative that we really attached ourselves to, and that's the narrative that we've been trying to change. And if you care about retirement security, if you care about pensions, if you care about income inequality, then you should be concerned around this debate around what's going on in Detroit. So let me just highlight a little bit on the pension stuff. So the Detroit bankruptcy clearly could be a legal precedent for other cities who have pension obligations that they're unable to meet or that they don't want to meet, right? Michigan is one of 9 states which explicitly protects employee pensions in the Constitution. And if the bankruptcy ends up resulting in a significant reduction in pensions as a measure of federal law, other cities are going to look at this as a possible option. And we already know, I know that, Rahm Emanuel in Chicago is looking at how he can reduce his pension funds obligation. I know that folks in Philadelphia are looking at how they're going to reduce their pension fund obligations. I know that other cities are looking at how this is going to affect their pension fund obligations. And I know for our public sector union members, this has come up in bargaining, whether their pension fund is fully funded or whether it's underfunded, not to the extent of Detroit, but it's come up almost everywhere. If this kind of Detroit agenda succeeds, what we're going to see is other municipalities considering the Chapter 9 bankruptcy as an appealing option, right? And this whole issue around the federal bankruptcy judge and the Constitution, although we know that there's going to be litigation around it, and certainly AFSCME and, a core group of unions who are leading on the litigation around the Detroit bankruptcy, as that well they should be, are involved in that, we're going to see this thing expand. It is not going to stop at 8 Mile. That's my whole mantra during this whole thing. It is not going to stop. So let's talk about the financial crisis. Robert Kuttner recently wrote that Detroit taxpayers are getting hit with a triple whammy, right? First, the homeowners lost the value of their homes, right? Thanks to the Wall Street created housing and financial crisis. Then the pensions are under attack, right? So public employees and taxpayers, who are also taxpayers, got into these risky financial deals, right? So they got the cops, they got the swaps, they got all of this stuff happening. And it created a dynamic that, is complicated, and they don't want us to be able to understand because they don't want us to be able to talk about it. And so one of the things that we did at SEIU is we kind of created this PowerPoint, and my colleague, John O'Shafer, he's not here today, created this PowerPoint about who broke Detroit, and we took it out and we used it to help crystallize people's experience to what the numbers were looking like. And I think that was a really helpful exercise. It helped us get some feedback, but it helped people validate and understand that what they were seeing and what they were experiencing was real, and it wasn't a figment of their imagination. So I want to talk a little bit about the income inequality issue, because I think, for me, this is the thing that becomes the most cogent as we're talking about what's going on in Detroit and what's beyond bankruptcy, that if we don't deal with this fundamental issue of income inequality, then we're going to really miss the boat. So we've seen in the U.S. a dramatic fall in mixed income neighborhoods, with more and more Americans living in either very high affluent neighborhoods or poor neighborhoods. So let's talk about Detroit. Between 2000 and 2007, Detroit led the nation in increasing economic segregation, posting over a 45% faster change rate than their nearest competitor, which was Oklahoma City. If you look back to the 1970s, 1970, only 13% of the metro's residents, the largest percentage of any large city at the time, lived in a poor or affluent neighborhood. 37 years later, the number has shot up to over 45%. So this dramatic increase is a 348% rise in 37 years. That's income inequality in Detroit. And let me just talk about the unions. I know I only got a couple of minutes. Because I think this whole issue about the right to work and income inequality and middle-class jobs is really an important conversation in Detroit. It might not be as important somewhere else, but it's important in Detroit. Do y'all agree? Yeah. Okay. So the traditional narrative of Detroit has positioned unions, and like we've got some kind of fanatical desire that our members would want to have things like food and health insurance and a decent retirement, right? But if you look at the expansion of income inequality and segregation, it has really been fueled by a collapse in union membership. From 1989 through 1996, in the midst of the region's collapse, Michigan can still boast a healthy union density with 26 to 24% of the state's workers belonging to a union. That's good, right? In the 15 years that followed, the same period when Detroit's population and prosperity dropped off the cliff, the crisis, union density plummeted 27%. Now, only 17.5% of Michigan's workers belong to a union, okay? This decline bears an eerie similarity to the increase in concentrated poverty, a 23.4 increase in 10 years, and income segregation, over 19% increase between 2000 and 2007. So we have to do something about income inequality. When you look at Detroit and you see the three fastest growing industries, or the three main employer industries that employ people in Detroit are healthcare, public sector, and what's the third one? Fast food. You cannot build a healthy Detroit economy based on fast food wages. You cannot build a healthy Detroit economy based on public sector jobs that are being devalued to equal fast food wages. We have to deal with income inequality, and I say that the unions are a part of that dialogue as well as everybody else in this room. Thank you.
Thank you for all of our brief presentations from Jim, Stuart, Chris, and Renee. I want to start our conversation from this point with three poignant questions. And just pulling from the presentations that we already heard, I want to give these three questions to our panelists for you guys to chew them over a little bit, give your first response, and then we'll give it to the audience for Q&A, okay? Our first question I want to put out there, and our conversation is about nationally, what are people looking at and saying about Detroit? I want our first question to be, the roadmap that Detroiters are laying out right now and are organizing, okay, how is that being perceived nationally, okay? And are people picking up the narrative? Mr. Carr brought up some good points earlier about changing our narrative and seeing whether or not it's really sticking to the meat of the problem. Another question I want to lay out is, what is the real role of government? Okay, how is that being perceived nationally? And are people picking up the narrative? Mr. Carr brought up some good points earlier about changing our narrative and seeing whether or not it's really sticking to the meat of the problem. Another question I want to lay out is, what is the real role of government? in this conversation, specifically on protecting consumers. I think all of us are consumers in one aspect or another. And as we've seen, the overruns in mortgages, the overruns in how our cities finance our public services could cause some question there. So what is the role of government in protecting consumers? And then my third question is, what's intentional about what we're doing? What's intentional? As an organizer myself, and being a progressive organizer, everything we do has to have a goal, right? But sometimes our intentions get lost. And everything I've heard in our 4 presentations just now that said every last actor that did what they did to Detroit and to any urban center, they did it intentionally. Intentionally, and it was clear. So what is our intention with that? So I want to go with round robin. You can raise your hand, jump up for joy if you want to go first, but please do not all answer at the same time. Go ahead, Ross.
Jim, you want to go first?
Sure. So first of all, how are things perceived nationally? Just to repeat what I said before, nationally, my perception is that there's an $18 billion problem in Detroit that is a result of mismanagement, and a big piece of it is pensions and health care. And that couldn't be any further removed from the truth. And so I think we really need to get a handle on that. I mean, the fact is, since the Great Recession, I believe something like 60% of the increase in the cost of pensions is due to the complex financial instruments that were used. Healthcare costs, in fact, have been less than the national average. I don't think people know that. I think people walk away saying Detroit is an administrative disaster, in large part a result of pensions. And I think we need to get a handle on that, because that is intentional public misrepresentation that's attempting to go after unionized organized workers. The second thing is, I think that the role of government should have played a profound role right here in Detroit to protect consumers. So for everything that was said about the subprime lending crisis, it's even worse, because many of those loans were actually designed to fail so as to trigger a refinancing 2 or 3 years down the road. That was the famous 327 subprime loan that Elizabeth Warren referred to so famously. And then also, many people actually took out 2 loans simultaneously without knowing that they had a second lien. They didn't know until they were trying to modify their loans that, in fact, they had signed 2 loans on the same day. So I do believe there's a role there, but I believe, unfortunately, the horse is out of the barn for that particular arena, but I do believe there's opportunity going forward. But I really believe the last piece is, to me, the big piece that's missing in Detroit is what is the big, profound, hairy, audacious idea that the citizens of Detroit are insisting that the city do in order to economically empower it. And so the way I look at that, and just giving less than 1 minute to say that, we know that wealth is created by ownership. And we know that the Detroit citizens were denied that through a whole host of things over the last half century, but most recently the subprime crisis. When people refer to Detroit, though, they talk about all the vacant and abandoned properties, and it's a mess, and it's crime, and on and on and on. But here's the bottom line: it's land, and that land does have value at some point. And so we know that there is an urban renaissance going on even in the most distressed cities, and including right here. So the question I would pose for the audience is, what do you think Detroit will look like 30 years from now? Do you think it's going to look like this? Or is it likely that we're going to see those seeds slowly percolate out? How they're going to percolate out, we don't know. But they will percolate out, and there will be a new Detroit 30 years from now that looks nothing like the Detroit today. And the question is, have we done a lot of thinking about, or enough thinking about, what that future looks like, and how we get current owners right now today to be part of owning that future growth? And the word I'll put on the table for your consideration is really edge of the envelope, out of the box use of eminent domain.
First of all, how nationally perceived? I don't want to leave the impression that because our lawsuit happens to be in Michigan, that this was solely a Michigan problem. Brandon and I were talking about it. I've been giving this talk around the country, and I talk about the issue of securitization, and I give Detroit as the example because we're doing the case in Detroit. It just so happens that we're now in Detroit. So it's here. But the reality of of it is that Morgan Stanley was not the only investment bank that was involved in this activity. New Century was not the only subprime lender, and it wasn't only taking place in Detroit. It was taking place across the entire country. It may have been exacerbated in Michigan, and particularly in Detroit, because of other factors that played into it. And for our ability to prove the case, it is certainly a more poignant case and one that we were able to factually substantiate here, but it's existing all over. So I know from the contacts that we've been receiving that this is not a phenomenon that is unique to Detroit. It is something that's going on all over the place. And by the way, the same investment banks that are no longer doing subprime, because subprime is no longer in popular interest, is now turning around and securitizing healthcare debt, credit card debt, and since we're at Wayne State, I should add, student loan debt. And they're doing it all over again. And, you know, for the purposes of sending the message, you've got to be able to say that this investment model is not working and someone has to control it, which leads to the answer to question number 2, the role of government. The regulators were not merely asleep, they were comatose during this. There is no way that anyone was doing any due diligence to allow these loans to go through, whether it be at the Federal Reserve Bank level or at the SEC level. It never should have happened. It should have been stopped at the spigot, and we need to make sure that they don't get lulled into complacency or more likely being bought off into turning the other way. Same thing for the rating agencies, by the way, as well. On the flip side, where's the enforcement? The enforcement's on behalf of the investors, and it's been rather weak, to be perfectly honest. No one is looking out for the interests of the mortgagors. There was one lawsuit brought by the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts against Morgan Stanley and New Century. They got a significant settlement out of the case, and not a single AG's office around the country duplicated it. No one followed suit. So government can both regulate up front in order to make sure this problem doesn't exist, and it should be out there supervising, not supervising and enforcing the laws to make sure it is being properly adhered to. And I couldn't agree more with Jim with what he said. The answer here, the reason why this happened, the reason why reverse redlining had occurred was because for 50 years, this community was deprived of what should have been an economic right, and that was the ability to own your own home, to build up equity, and to build up your own wealth. Instead, what we have happen here is that whatever wealth had been built up has now been lost, and we need to start that process all over again. 25 years of building up equity was lost in 3 years. It's ridiculous. And what we need to do is to start rebuilding that equity, getting people into homes with loans that are affordable, meaningful, and payable, so people can have something that they can pass down to their children.
And the trustees did not understand that the risk that they were subject to when they were buying these securitized mortgage-backed securities, right? And so we had to go through this whole process of helping them to understand, and, you know, the same folks who sold them, many of the pension funds around the country, not, you know, I don't know the numbers specifically on Detroit, but they lost money on these investments, right? So again, that's why we have to understand when we're looking at these pension funds, Detroit, Michigan, Chicago, we're talking about an aggregate of billions of dollars of investment capital that could be used to revitalize communities besides, you know, providing the retirement benefits. The money does something while it's waiting for you to retire. And so, you know, being a part of that conversation and that dialogue is important. And I think, you know, where we look at, you know, how we concentrate wealth, we look at home ownership, but we have to look at these pools of capital like pension funds that are solely controlled primarily by working people, billions of dollars. And we have to be creative and think out of the box, both about how we engage those folks who are making those decisions and making sure that we allow them to make decisions that help rebuild our communities and not tear them down. If we're going to be intentional, and Brandon said, what's intentional? I know what's intentional for me right now in the immediate future, if you want me to say that. And I would say, you know, something got to change in the state of Michigan. And it's an election coming up, and we need to be about changing that if we're serious. I'm just going to put it out there, all right? So, you know, is that going to change the whole story? No, because if we don't hold him accountable, we're not going to come out any better, you know, either way. And that's from the unions or from the community standpoint. So the role of government is going to really be shaped by what the folks who are sitting in these chairs today does with the information that y'all are getting, over these past 2 days and what you do beyond bankruptcy. What are you going to do when you leave this room? You're going to be the ones to define what the role of government is around the bankruptcy, around, the swaps deal, the trials, what happens in Flint or Saginaw. We are the people who can help make that happen. And I just want to give a shout out, my girl Jocelyn Wooders. Jocelyn, stand up. She's a community engagement person for the AFL-CIO. She's here today. They're going to be doing some community engagement work, and so if you're a community person, leader, advocacy group, you need to make sure you see Jocelyn before this thing is over with. So I've done, my part. We're trying to figure it out, right? We can't figure it out by ourselves. We got to be in dialogue.
And to close the dialogue, we're going to give it to my brother going to Puerto Rico.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of, the national dialogue, and it started long before the bankruptcy, right? It's been the last few years, is around these incredibly generous benefits, to use the term that's out there, around retirement that public sector workers get, particularly municipal and state workers and school employees. And the concept of being able to retire with some level of pension, and what's very key in Detroit and other places is the move to conflate long-term retiree health benefit costs with how much the pension is going to cost long-term, because these become incredibly huge numbers. That's how you can get to $18 billion, none of which is due in the next year or 2 or 3 or even 10. It's a 30-year number.
Right.
And we don't calculate on a net present value how much it costs to run the state prison system. That's an annual appropriation. If we said that the prison system over 30 years, doing some projection of sentencing and whatever else, will cost, $4 billion, suddenly the state of Michigan would be in a much worse place from a financial standpoint. The other thing, and I think that this, in some ways, is playing out in a way that our states have played out for a long time in our histories, right? Albany, and who represents other parts of the state, has a very different view of New York City and what should be done than New York City. Philadelphia versus other parts of the state. And sometimes that gets worse and better, and there's more, and I think Detroit versus Lansing is playing out in that particular way. And what I would also just suggest, and I'm not sure if other people have put this out, is that Michigan has had a surplus for a number of years. Ohio had a surplus in its state budget for a number of years now. Pennsylvania had a surplus for a number of years. And those surpluses were being talked about and debated in each of those states while cuts to state and local governments were going on. And people were saying, well, if we have a surplus, do we really have to do all the cuts you put out in your budget? And the answer, Wisconsin, the same thing, from so many of these places is, yes, we do. Because the whole point is, if we don't get them to tighten their belts, they'll end up in the same, it's paternalistic, in the same place. So while there's a surplus, state and local governments, Detroit at the most extreme point probably of other places, are having to continue to either raise property taxes to the extent that states allow them to, or income taxes to the estate, because Detroit can't raise its income tax anymore. It has a local option income tax. It can't, if the citizens wanted to, it can't. The state has said that you're at your limit. So I think I just go back. The 2010 election was an awful election at the worst possible time, and that challenge will take a long time to overcome, although the 2014 election in some big ways could reset some of what's gone on.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, panel. We got a few minutes, so I'm going to take a few questions. I got one right here from Tom Stevens, and then I'll take 2 more. Sir here, And then I got to get a woman in here, Monica. Yep, I got to get Monica.
Short one. Can you tell us about the role of Quicken Loans?
Was that for me? No.
Or anybody else?
Well, Quicken is a different model. I mean, it's, Quicken itself is sort of a hybrid in terms of bank corporation. It is certainly part of the problem. It's not the same issue as we're dealing with the securitization issue per se. And the biggest challenge that you have there is the underwriting standards that they're using on that. I believe, and I don't want to speak out too far out of hand, I'm believing that they do fall under the auspices of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau now, something which did not exist during the mid to late 80s, and one would hope that some of the worst excesses that were occurring during the predatory loan scams could not happen again coming forward. By the way, there is indications, small rumblings that the predatory loan market is coming back again, at least the subprime market is coming back again. I should distinguish. We often discuss whether all subprime loans are predatory loans. They're not necessarily, but we are seeing subprime loans beginning to rear their head again, and if they do, it tends, their evil twin tends to follow along very shortly afterwards.
So if I could answer the Quicken Loan question too. So Dan Gilbert, through one of his startups, it's called the Picket Report, is helping suburbanites move to the city by providing a Carfax report for a home. This Carfax report for homes involves aggregating millions of pieces of demographic and socioeconomic data into a database which allows prospective homeowners to select the perfect neighborhood. And this, I think, was a controversy, came out in 2012. And so it includes public descriptions like describing communities like struggling societies, an economically challenged mix of singles, divorced, and widowed individuals in smaller cities and urban areas looking to make ends meet. Soul survivors, older, downscale African-American singles and single parents established in a modern urban home. So, I mean, this is, Dan Gilbert is building a business model that not only includes his mortgage business, but also kind of helping those folks who want to repopulate urban cities by providing this type of information to them. So you can say whether it's good or bad, but it certainly is controversial. So I'll just say that.
Yes, sir.
Hi, sorry. I want to just make a comment about how to change the narrative or changing the narrative. I was at a conference this weekend in Chicago, and I heard someone from the Chicago Teachers Union, and they were talking about the pension issue and the Rahm Emanuel story. And one of the things they suggested, which is what they were doing, is they said, look, whenever there's a big event like a Super Bowl, they always talk about how much money this brings in to pump up the local economy. So they took what the underfunded status of the Chicago Teachers Pension Union was, and then they looked at how much the pension fund pays to retirees, and then calculated how much the money paid to retirees flows into the Chicago economy, and did a cost-benefit analysis to show that the pension fund promotes economic development and economic growth, puts more into the Chicago economy than the underfunded status takes out of the Chicago economy. And maybe for some of those unions who are familiar with the specifics of the Detroit pension fund, you could do something that would help change the narrative to say that these pensioners aren't dragging down the economy of Detroit, but rather they're really building it up.
So on the Chicago, they also did analysis by zip code, right? So they were able to look at the impact on the pensions on zip codes with a specific focus on communities of color and the economic activity that the pension funds generated in those specific zip codes. And that analysis is amazing, so.
Monica?
Even over the course of yesterday and the day, people are still saying Detroit filed for bankruptcy. We didn't file for bankruptcy. Jones Day and an unelected dictator filed for bankruptcy. So if we would just change that small piece, it would help change people's perspective about it. But my question to those, especially in the union, What are we doing in terms of creating a better understanding and more collaboration with our union members that may not live in the city of Detroit? Because I was a part of those negotiations that Councilmember Watson led in terms of bringing unions to the table because there was this racializing of, oh, that's just Detroit. And these issues aren't going to impact us. And so you had a number of unions outside the city of Detroit that would not support the initiative around addressing the emergency manager law. They would only stick to the issues around right to work. Well, some of that has lent itself to getting us in the place we are now. What is the plan and the strategy for moving those particular individuals forward?
I just wanted to say, I don't know if anybody has had the opportunity to read Kurt Guyet's piece in the Metro Times, the April 2nd, The Anatomy of a Bankruptcy. I just wanted to say, in answer to the whole thing, Jones Day, this was all contrived. In 2011, they did a research, had two of their lawyers, I passed out to 30 folks, had their attorneys research how to take municipalities, especially the urban ones, into bankruptcy, a Chapter 9 bankruptcy. So this was all contrived. And so, we're, trying to figure out why. Because they knew what they were going to do in the first place. They were going to take us into bankruptcy. When Brandon, when we were all going up to Lansing, doing all the petitions and all of that, before we did that, they had already did the research. Please get the Kurt's in the Metro Times, the 2nd through the 8th issue, because he tells about all of that they had already planned it. Jones Day. So it was all by design. So thank you for letting me speak.
If I could answer Monica's, yeah.
Among union members in the state of Michigan. And
So Monica, I can't answer your question specifically around the racial issues and what happened during the whole right to work stuff. But what I can say is that when we released the Demos report, there were a lot of union folks who were in that room who appreciated the analysis and were actually surprised by the number of community folks who were present and who wanted that information. And so I think it's just the process of having an ongoing dialogue. And I do think that, in some cases, maybe they underestimate the capacity and passion that our community allies can bring to the table, if I'm just being honest about it. So I just think we have to persist. And then I think we just have to work with the folks that you can work with. And we'll try to bring the other folks to the table. I mean, the reason that Jocelyn's here today is because, we've had a conversation about explaining to her, what's going on and that she should be in the room. And so hopefully that'll extend to the other unions in Detroit, but I can only speak for mine.
And then just one point, and we gotta take our last question here, but one point about the Detroit versus the other communities conversation, and just doing some research around the district I live in Rifford Township. Rifford Township right now, 80% of its costs go to police and fire. 86% of its costs go to police and fire. To handle the OPEB benefits and the unfunded liabilities, there's now an additional tax to handle the pension taxes and whatever unfunded liability that may have that can increase every year automatically. My dad's taxes on his house this year, outside of his general tax, the second highest tax was to cover police and fire pension. And I know that the police officers that retired from Rifford Township don't require that much money. So there's a conversation that we need to have about how pensions are being structured. Because if some folks at the big fat top, the big fat cats, if they can get 3 and 4, 5 time multipliers on their pension, that's not fair to the everyday cop. It's not. And that's something that we've seen in Wayne County. Wayne County has had some of those same problems. So there is a conversation around pensions that we need to have because those costs, every last cost is being balanced on the homeowner at the end of the day. And I think we haven't said much about that. Every last cost in our municipalities goes right back to the homeowner. It goes to their taxes, and that's what's pricing out those middle-class families that have paid their due, that look like myself, that now can't get a second job. These are the people that are being moved out right now. They're being priced out, and I haven't heard that any in this conversation. So I wanted just to say that the communities that surround Detroit are now buckling, and they tried to do some other things to get around from emergency management, and it's not helping. It's not helping at all.